All right, let's get started with the last panel of the day. America loves FIDO. So, by the way, thanks for sticking with us all day. I know it's 5 o'clock and it's a little bit late to be doing stuff. Let me come over here so folks can see the rest of our panel. So, a lot of governments across the globe have embraced FIDO authentication. None of them stands out more than the US government. Use of FIDO has been highlighted as a best practice by the White House, by CISA, by NIST, the Federal Trade Commission, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Additionally, we heard earlier today how the US government's login.gov program has embraced passkeys to enable Americans to log into dozens of government services with better authentication than they were using before. So on this panel, we've got a handful of officials from different parts of the US government talking about their perspectives on the importance of FIDO authentication. And just to tee things up, Department of Homeland Security, CISA, has called FIDO the gold standard of MFA. The White House has required every agency and contractor to use phishing-resistant MFA, stated all public-facing applications have to offer it as an option, specifically called out FIDO by name as the standard agency should be using here. The NSA, thrilled to have Karen Staley here from there, has flagged FIDO Alliance as a standards development organization that's core to its mission priority around strong authentication. And NIST was so moved by the introduction of synced passkeys, they put out a special supplement to their digital identity guidelines that actually changed legacy guidance on credential syncing and laid out how you can start to use this new innovation in authentication in the ecosystem. So if you've been wondering, why is this the only panel at Authenticate that gets a heart emoji in the title? Well, it's because there's a lot going on here. Let me start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and the role that they play in the US government. Karen, can we start with you?
So, as mentioned, my name is Karen Staley. I work for the National Security Agency for our Center for Cybersecurity Standards.
Right. Grant.
Yeah, I'm Grant Dasher. I work at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a component of DHS focused on reducing risk to national critical infrastructure. And secure digital identity and authentication is a piece of that, since, as we've seen, so many threats are identity focused.
And I'm Andy Regenscheid. I lead the cryptographic technology group at NIST, where I work on really a variety of projects about using cryptography to make systems more secure. That includes both our portfolio on the encryption and digital signature standards, as well as, in this case, our work on digital identity. That includes both work on NIST's foundational guidance in 863, that's in many cases targeted more towards the public-facing use cases, as well as being the technical lead on the personal identity verification standards, which is the PKI-based smart card identification card that the US government uses for employees and contractors.
Great, thanks. I wanted to start with the first question for Grant. So CISA has been doing some really great work to promote phishing-resistant authentication outside of government, also doing work to help agencies internal to government to improve their security posture, in part by helping with implementation of the White House's 2022 Zero Trust strategy, which required phishing-resistant authentication. How would you say it's going in the agencies, and what do you think needs to happen next?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going. I think it's going reasonably well. There's a long history here. People have been working on this problem in many respects. The government has been a leader in strong authentication, going back to 15, 20, 25 years ago, investing in what was at the time became PIV cards. And I think there's been long been a recognition that strong authentication is critical to security on the employee and contractor side, and then I think more recently a recognition, especially post-pandemic, about the importance of account takeovers and issues like that to the increasing digitization of government services for the government's outward-facing mission. And we've seen a lot of innovation there, a lot of increased adoption of more secure authentication technologies. I think what Andy said earlier today about how there are impediments from legacy technology, legacy architectural decisions, overly constrained solution spaces in some cases is definitely an obstacle. But I think we are seeing agencies adopting more secure authentication, phishing-resistant authentication, including FIDO. And as agencies are modernizing their broader architectures, that's enabling adoption of authentication technologies like FIDO in more and more places. And I think we are definitely going in the right direction, although, everything in the government moves slowly than I think any one of us would like. And that's true for many reasons, but I do think we are seeing progress.
Thanks. I wanted to turn to Andy. So you guys did something earlier this year that I had never seen NIST do before, which was put out, maybe it's happened before, but put out a supplement to a special publication that was effective immediately, that was very much focused on this new innovation of sync passkeys. And I think it's something that a lot of people in the authentication community have had some challenges wrapping their head around, and that for years we were always told, never export keys. That's very, very bad. Now there's been a change. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what led you to come out with the supplement here in the middle of revising the digital identity guidelines, and how some of the thinking you think has evolved here?
Yeah, I mean, not exporting keys on cryptographic authenticators was like motherhood and apple pie. It wasn't really questioned. I think what we saw was a change in technology and a change in standards, and that with the rapid adoption of passkeys and syncable authenticators on many of the platforms that we use, we understood the important role that this was going to play. As you started your remarks, I think you'll see a theme across all of our agencies that phishing-resistant authentication is really critical. And if you look at the options out there, there's really only a small set of authentication, standards-based authentication technologies, that can provide that, with passkeys, WebAuthn, and PKI and client auth TLS being sort of the main examples. So, we've always felt that FIDO was is a critical technology for bringing phishing-resistant authentication to the masses, both for the public users that are coming to government services, as well as even some use cases within the federal enterprise. So our goal, ultimately, with releasing what I think was really the first supplement of its kind with 863, was to make it very clear to agencies and technology providers that we consider syncable passkeys to be AAL2. We also wanted to then, provide some guidance and some bounds around what we expect from, the sync fabrics that play a critical role in securing those keys as they are synced between devices, and also provide some guidance to, the agencies that, would be considering deploying their use. Yeah, I mean, I think this has been. Yeah, I mean, I think there's kind of different use cases here, both in the public-facing side, where you have users coming in with personally owned devices, as well as then cases with enterprise scenarios where you have users using enterprise devices. And those, the supplement that we released, tries to cover both guidance as well as considerations for each of those cases.
I wanted to dive in just a little deeper on that, because I think it was one of the things that stood out was you were very clear saying, I mean, getting back to the motherhood and apple pie and don't ever clone and sync and export your keys, different risk profiles when it comes to what we might be dealing with, say, using passkeys at login.gov versus to actually secure an agency's own resources for the enterprise side. How did you sort of look at each of those in terms of recommending perhaps additional controls on the latter?
Right. I mean, it's a combination of both different risk profiles, different notions of who is ultimately bearing some of the risk in the transactions, as well as different deployment models. It's very different if you're in a situation where you have a citizen using their own device, using their own phone to come to a government service and register it, versus if you're in an enterprise scenario, accessing enterprise-owned resources, using an enterprise-managed device. So, in the first case with consumers, basically just even from a practical perspective, there's a limit to what you're going to be able to expect from those devices. That's not new to passkeys. I mean, we see the same thing with things like when people use SMS OTP, you are, extending trust effectively to their mobile device, to their mobile network operator. It's a very different situation when you start talking about enterprise scenarios. I think that the risk goes up, but there's many more controls that are practical for you to put in place. Particularly within the federal government, we expect that the mobile devices that we're using will be under device management. And in those cases, it's going to be practical to use some of those MDM features to enforce some policies around how those passkeys are managed on the device and how they could be shared or synced across different devices. So we think those kinds of capabilities make a lot of sense in the enterprise scenarios, but they're really not practical to deploy for the consumer-facing ones.
Got it. Thanks. Karen, I wanted to turn to you. I think a lot of the folks in the room probably understand where NIST and CISA fit into this equation. They're used to seeing them at conferences. The NSA, you're not out there speaking as much. So could you tell us a little bit about the NSA's interest here?
So I appreciate some of the things that have already been said, but for NSA, just as a quick reminder, part of our mission is to secure national security systems, which are information or telecommunications networks for things like intelligence activities, nuclear control, and command weapon systems, big stuff. And so for U.S. public policy has been that national security systems would be secured by PKI, very mature technology. But with that said, we recognize that national security systems have to interact with other systems and other partners. So from our perspective, FIDO could help raise the bar for other partners that are not able to invest in PKI. That's why we're here.
Great. Thank you. I wanted to shift back to Grant. So one of the things CISA has really been doing a nice job the last couple of years is giving advice to organizations outside of government, really trying to help the private sector, it's probably starting with critical infrastructure, but also others, sort of know what they should be doing. What has the message been when it comes to authentication, and how would you say it's being received with parties outside of government?
Yeah, I think it's being relatively well received. I think there's been a maturing, really a change, I guess, in CISA's historical role in this area. For a number of years, we were the ICS cert people. We were the people who would publish vulnerabilities on control systems and publish threat advisories about certain threat actor behavior and things like that. I think in the last couple of years, as the sort of notion of what our leadership calls operational collaboration has become more clear, there's become this understanding that you can't really sort of cleanly separate these different areas, operational threat information sharing, from general cybersecurity architecture, technical assistance or guidance or other kinds of things. And so we've tried to, find a lane for ourselves there in terms of taking, the threat ecosystem as we see it and translating it into ways to improve cybersecurity at an organizational level, at an ecosystem level with work that we're doing targeted towards vendors. And I think that's been, by and large, well received. I think sometimes there's questions about, why is the CISA saying this versus someone else? We've done a lot of work with our partners at NSA and FBI and in the Five Eyes to sort of synchronize a lot of the messaging so that more often than not, when any one of us is publishing something, it comes out under a co-seal, and so that's been a way of sort of amplifying the voice of the quad, as they call it, or the sort of operationally focused cybersecurity agencies in the U.S. government. And I think that's been positive. There's always room for improvement, but we've generally seen people have appreciated what we're doing, that the sort of threat-based insights are helpful, that some of the amplification of key messages like FIDO being the gold standard of authentication and some of the things we've said around Secure Our World public PSA campaign, things like that have maybe moved the needle a little bit and I think been positive.
Thanks. Open question for anybody. So I mentioned at the start of this session all of the different agencies that have pointed to FIDO and the use of phishing-resistant authentication, both for the government's use as well as for what the private sector should be doing. A lot of policy saying you're allowed to use it, or even that you should use it. Adoption's been a little uneven, I think both in government and in the private sector. What do you think are the barriers that are out there? You know, what's holding things back? Is it just too new and people need to take time to sort of wrap their head around it? Or, say, in the government, are there other issues, say, like budgets or know-how in the agencies or things like that? So who wants to take that one?
I'll go first, and then I'm sure other people have thoughts. You know, I don't think there's any one cause of this. I think there's a lot of different things that sort of combine with each other, and there's definitely a little bit of a chicken and the egg problem. Some of it was policy ambiguity. You know, there were different policies come out at different times. I think a lot of that has sort of aligned behind this core set of messages around phishing-resistant authentication and so on. And I think that's been helpful. But yes, there are economic challenges that agencies face. If you have to do A and B costs a bunch of money, are you also going to do B? There are some ways to navigate those in terms of, you know, aligning bulk procurement and things like that. But that is definitely part of it. Part of it is institutional knowledge. I mean, it's not a surprise to anyone in this room that the government contracts out a huge fraction of its IT. I mean, a good chunk of the US government's digital identity experts are in this room. And I think that is definitely a phenomenon that has, you know, it takes time for this stuff to distill. You know, some initiatives that were stood up in 2021, 2022 with the OMB Zero Trust memo are still going, and we're starting to see agencies deploying, you know, for example, FIDO in certain use cases that they've been working on for the last two and a half years, and I think you'll see more of that. So I definitely think there's, you know, I don't know that there's any one factor. We have sort of opened up the policy aperture and said, hey, here's the standard, find different ways that make sense in your particular situation to achieve that standard while also achieving your mission. And we're starting to see the fruits of that innovation happen, but it's definitely a slow process.
Yeah, those are all great points. I think, you know, I'm sure many agencies would more than welcome some additional funds to modernize their systems, but it's, you know, ultimately it's more complicated than that too. You know, identity is so fundamental to you know, our IT systems with touch points to all the applications that we use. You know, this is not a trivial thing, you know, to modernize the, you know, the single sign-on stacks that any large enterprise like the federal government has. And with so many priorities, both to, I think, you know, perhaps expand into maybe new mission areas or address, you know, a variety of the, you know, cybersecurity threats that we face today. You know, we're asking, you know, we're asking our IT staff to do a lot. And I think that, you know, that there's this challenge then just in terms of the manpower and staffing in order to accommodate all of these different priorities that we have.
Great, thanks. Another open question. Sorry, Karen, did you have any thoughts to add on this?
I think it's been covered to some extent, but just from a national security system perspective, FIDO doesn't integrate really well with our enterprise needs. So the privacy protection mechanisms are a little bit complicated for our needs.
So let me follow up on that with, I don't know if I'd call it a spicy question, but you know, a little bit of controversy. So we are coming up next year on the 25th anniversary of the creation of the Common Access Card. It was actually created with a memo that I think John Hamre was the DoD comptroller, signed in 2000, or maybe it was late 1999, that said, there shall be a Common Access Card, and it will use smart cards and PKI. And mind you, we redid the standards a few later with HSPD 12, but 25 years is a pretty long time to be reliant on any technology platform, let alone one in security, where threats and technologies and just the way we compute is always evolving, you know, very quickly. I mean, we all have supercomputers in our pockets right now that, you know, 25 years ago we would be coming to work and sitting at a static desktop, which is sort of what the CAC was designed for. Some of the people are asking, Are there ways that we could be, should we be looking to FIDO not just as a complementary authenticator within the government, but maybe as the primary authenticator in lieu of a CAC or a PIV card? Is that desirable? Should we be pursuing that? And if so, how close do you think that is to a reality? What do we not have yet that we might need to enable its use as a primary authenticator?
So this comes up a lot with our PIV program and PIV standards. Some of you have probably heard me give this spiel, but there is so much more to PIV than just the smart card. Much of the work in that is the identity proofing process that we go through before the issuance of those, and the sort of broader trust infrastructure to allow agencies to, be able to, accept each other's credentials. I think PIV has done, and the PKI credentials on them has done a, remarkably good job of being a very flexible authenticator, but I don't think there was ever any thought that it would be the only authenticator that we would ever use. And certainly as time has gone on, we've seen more systems that that don't support native or direct PKI authentication. We see new classes of devices like mobile phones and tablets and small form factor laptops that don't have integrated smart card readers, and it can be honestly a bit of a pain to use PIV on those platforms. So we still want to take what is what we need from the PIV ecosystem, while also being able to take advantage of new technologies, like FIDO. And the way that we see this ultimately working, is that, that again, like PIV isn't. Don't think of PIV as the smart card. Think of it as kind of that identity account based on the identity proofing process. Your PIV card with your PKI credentials is part of that, as well as any other derived credentials that you might use, like FIDO credentials, that that you might use for logical access. And I could certainly imagine a world where where you might be using like passkeys as the typical authenticator for accessing government systems on a daily basis. Now, I don't think PIV cards themselves are going anywhere. I think both, there's still, a benefit to having that interoperable credential. I think it also plays an important role within our, physical access control systems within the government as well. So I think that still has an important role, but there's certainly, I think, a place and, in many cases, a need for being able to use other authenticators within the PIV ecosystem, like passkeys and FIDO.
Karen or Grant, any perspectives?
I would just add, I agree with everything Andy said. I would just add, look at the parallel world over in sort of emerging consumer, let's call it ecosystem, or at least government benefit sort of ecosystem. No one is saying that FIDO should replace, all aspects of identity proofing, should replace the set of standards around, defining what qualifies a person to get a particular, set of claims on their identity, presentation of those claims to relying parties. It's a piece, and it's coupled to this let me sign into my account after my account has been established part of the problem. The broader ecosystem has other pieces, and we see a whole other community talking about verifiable credentials and MDocs and all this stuff, and how those two things are going to fit together in one coherent whole, I think, is still being sorted out. PIV captures that entire problem space for the government. And so it's not as simple as just replacing it all with FIDO. You have to replace the entire constellation in some way. And is there a world in which you could reimagine all of that built on top of the set of standards that are emerging, in whether it's the European version or some of the other stuff, verifiable credentials, all this stuff. Is there some harmonized world where you could fit the government's, you could tailor all of that to solve the US government's employee and contractor problem? Maybe, hypothetically. We are not really particularly near that world, and so I think getting the piece of it that is line of sight sorted out and working really well like, because it solves real problems for us, right? I mean, we do have this downgrade to password thing. Like, we joke about it, but like, it's a real thing, right? You can call your help desk and get your PIV card turned off, kind of thing, in some scenarios. That's not, like, that's a cybersecurity issue, and so we do think there are major cybersecurity opportunities with FIDO, and it could be a building block to a greater, things in the future. But yeah.
Karen?
So, just to articulate the NSA perspective, as said, we have really strong confidence in PKI as a mature technology, and as Andy alluded to, PIV covers a lot of things, and for our national security systems, we require extensive vetting and user accountability. So that would be something that we would need, and we need to be able to revoke authenticators from a single point. And so unlimited or untraceable sharing of credentials then enabled by FIDO is something that's problematic for us. So from our perspective right now, CAC provides the greatest assurance for us.
Understood. I wanted to go back to Andy. One of the things that stood out to me when you issued the supplement was a statement that, again, getting back to the motherhood and apple pie and never, clone and export keys, you all looked at every other authenticator that was allowed at AAL2 and concluded that those were all shareable as well. An OTP can obviously be phished or handed to somebody off. Even a push notification, you can be essentially tricked into giving it to somebody else by pushing it in response to a phishing attack. And it sort of reminded me of something I've been saying actually a lot lately when it comes to identity and authentication, which is there aren't perfect solutions, but there are some solutions that suck less than others, which is a terrible tagline. Use passkeys, they suck less. But there was an element of the supplement that sort of, I'm paraphrasing here now, of course, more or less said that everything else at AAL2 is also shareable, and passkeys are at least phishing resistant. So wanted to just
well, I think some of what that was a reaction to is, sometimes when you're deploying a new technology, it gets compared against, to the ideal case or what the perfect case, as opposed to what we're using today. And I think, that was us trying to ground the discussion in, all right, what are we using today in place of things like passkeys? And in many cases, that's, SMS OTP, maybe one-time password apps, maybe, unfortunately, just passwords. And as you said, those are all phishable authenticators by their very nature. There's nothing that stops a user from, taking that authenticator output, taking that password, sharing it with somebody else. In some cases, looking at some of the technologies that are out there, that's done can be done in different automated manners. Like, with your SMS messages might be going to a variety of devices that you own. Your one-time password seeds in your apps might already be synced across different devices. So, this is, some of these, some of the concerns that are raised with syncable and shareable authenticators like passkeys really aren't new to passkeys. There's things that we've already been dealing with, and I think some of the techniques that, that relying parties and organizations have used to sort of manage that risk ultimately still apply. Some of the risk analytic techniques or risk signals that you look at are still going to be important to use in a lot of cases, whether you're using those phishable authentication techniques or things like passkeys.
Another open question. So we touched on this earlier. I think one of the things that's been helping drive government interest in the use of FIDO, not just in the US, but across the globe, is that the threats that we're dealing with against authentication have really evolved the last few years. Back in the days when I was at NIST, very old days now, ancient times, we were thrilled in the consumer space if people used any kind of MFA at all, and that even a texted one-time passcode, hey, that's better than a password, and let's encourage people to adopt that. It'll still blunt most attacks. But the attackers are getting more sophisticated, as they tend to do, and a lot of the tools that might have kept them out a few years ago can now be phished or otherwise compromised. It does seem, though, like there is a gap between where the threats currently are and where I think a big part of the cybersecurity community's knowledge of those threats are, and how to best guard against them. Would love to know how would you describe this gap? I mean, whether it's in authentication or just other areas more generally, and what do you think we can be doing to close it?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that because I unfortunately got to leave and go to the airport relatively quickly after this. But I think, I agree fully with the premise, and we've tried to be really leaning into this basic premise in our outward messaging. Part of the issue is definitions, right? So there's not a consistent set of definitions about what we're talking about when we're talking about phishing. We're trying to use it to talk about social engineering to compromise someone's primary credential or their authenticator, the authentication activity. But some people will use it to involve malware. Some people will use it to include other sort of social engineering attacks. I've even heard, credential or like session token theft be referred to as phishing, and a lot of this sort of conversation by people who are knowledgeable enough about authentication to be dangerous, but not true identity experts, sort of conflates all this stuff together, and like FIDO bypass becomes, just the same as every other MFA bypass. Like a lot of the nuance is lost. So we do think a more, and as I talked about in my talk earlier today, slightly more rigorous approach, which is, defining particular design goals for your system. And I think NIST has historically done a phenomenal job of this in the identity space, and they continue to, but particular security properties that you want your authentication system to have, and then particular technical solutions that let you achieve those security properties and just eliminate entire classes of threats. So phishing, as we define it, is a class of threat that we think you can just entirely eliminate with phishing-resistant authenticators or FIDO. Now, does that mean it will eliminate the ability to steal session tokens? No, you need to then look at, other things there, such as, bound credentials, and even those are imperfect, break and inspect proxies and all the rest of it. What do you get? Like, there's a rabbit hole, like it's very deep and very complicated, but you can reason through from a technical point of view controls to defeat all of these different scenarios. And when you combine them together, you can get to a very, very, very strong place. Perfect? No. The attackers are very sophisticated, but certainly enough to fundamentally change the economics of the cybersecurity problem from an adversary point of view. I mean, someone that I respect says, adversaries have budgets too. Some of them have bigger budgets, but they all have budgets. And so by changing the economics, you can materially make the problem harder and improve the security. And so I think, that is the approach that we're trying to bring to the conversation, and think about this as, okay, what is the problem? What are the security properties that defeat that threat? How do we engineer those into our systems so that we can either eliminate the cause in the case of many vulnerabilities, or at least have controls that eliminate the effectiveness of a particular technique? And we think that approach, rinsed and repeated many, many times over across different scenarios, can build true, robust security into technology.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think, along the similar lines, like, I don't know if I necessarily agree that within every organization, like, there's a misunderstanding of the risks there. I think some of this might be driven more on the, like, views and perceptions on the solutions-based side than the risk-based side, in the sense that, these are, it's now gotten to a point where things like phishing, it's a chronic risk that we've been forced to, that we've been forced to deal with and develop a set of, controls to try to monitor for attacks and detect them. So we've been dealing with that. And I think then there's some level of comfort in the techniques that are used there. I think another big piece, though, is that there's often of the newer technologies that can do a better job, that can make things easier both for the for the user and for the organization. And I think sometimes the trick is really making it, making sure people understand what technologies are out there and making it easier for them to adopt those technologies.
Thanks. By the way, Grant has to leave a little early to catch a flight, so that's why we're seeing him bolt off the stage, but it gets me a seat, which is really nice. So before I go on to the next question, Karen, any perspectives on, well, what we've been talking about, challenges between threat and understanding of threat?
Well, I just wanted to add, we've talked about this NIST standard and the supplement, and then Grant made reference to some things that CISA has been involved in. What we do at NSA is we have the Enduring Security Framework, where we work with other government agencies and also with industry to provide mitigation guidance. So that's something that we're doing as an agency, is to try to get that information out there as we become aware of it.
Great. Now, I'd say ESF work's been really good, and actually leads me to an excellent follow-up question, which is about a year ago, CISA and the NSA together through the ESF outlined a paper that I read it and I described it as a politely worded message on where the identity sector still has some more work to do to address some gaps in the ecosystem. Would love if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of what the message was, and also specifically, since we're sitting here at a FIDO Alliance event, if there's any messages in terms of areas where you think this organization and the community have more work to do.
It's a shame Grant's not here, but I would say that our message, we did release a paper on things we wanted, hope the community would understand or think about, like when, for example, we were hoping originally for a more precise definition of phishing resistance. That's already been discussed, and I think NIST has done some work there. We still like to distinguish a little more between phishing resistance from mutual authenticators using PKI to resist, an attacker in the middle. It's an ongoing effort to be sure people understand the difference between the security features of the syncable passkeys versus the device-bound passkeys. And we also would like to see, I know this came up in another panel, that the AAL2 was pretty broad, so we'd like to encourage FIDO to work with single sign-on and relying parties to adapt standards that would recognize specific strengths and weaknesses of various multi-factor authenticators. And I'll say, you didn't ask this question, but I just to add for my wish list for FIDO, echoing something Andy said earlier, FIDO Alliance put out a white paper on quantum resistance, and we know they're looking into that more, so we'd love to see that effort continue.
Great, thanks. Any thoughts, particularly on that last topic, since you, in addition to owning authentication, also own post-quantum?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be, the post-quantum crypto migration is going to be a major challenge for, the industry as a whole, not just within FIDO, but across, cryptography is just used so many places across our infrastructure. So this will take some time, but that makes it extra important then to, to identify, where and how you're using cryptography in order to determine what changes you're going to have to make to the standards, to the technologies, to your architectures in order to accommodate that, that move to quantum-resistant crypto. I think some of we're asking about other things that FIDO Alliance can do. I think I was really excited to hear about the Passkey Central announcement. I think getting more direct and actionable guidance on how to use these technologies is going to be really helpful to relying parties and other organizations. I don't think it stops there, though, in the sense that I think sometimes where things get complicated is how technologies like FIDO fit into the broader architecture, the broader ecosystem of things like how does this fit in with our the federation protocols that we use, or how does this fit in with other emerging standards like device-bound session cookies. And I think being able to sort of lay out that bigger picture of how these things fit together as part of an overall, architecture or system could be really valuable.
All right, thanks. That was all the questions I had typed up, but we do have some time to take questions from the audience if anybody has one, or if anybody's with us virtually, you can submit it through the app, but nobody has yet. So who's got a question? Bill's got a question. I was about to say we could break for the bar early, but no. I'm just giving you a hard time.
I'm going to start out with saying, I really appreciate everything that your organizations have done, but I do have just 2 questions. You talked through the problem of your legacy systems, but you also talked about greenfield efforts. So I'm just wondering, I haven't seen strong guidance that for new initiatives that we will not accept things that are still using passwords, or we will, so where we can actually start using the value of a government, that your buying purchase power, to actually shape how organizations provide products. Have you considered that space? How can you up-level the entire ecosystem by being selective in procurement?
Well, I think that's a really good point. I think, a challenge that we always have is, we can only procure what we can buy, like what exists on the market. I think another big challenge that we face is the number of true greenfield deployments and within the government, I think, is actually quite limited. These systems are almost always fitting into some existing infrastructure. And so that itself brings with it, some constraints. But yeah, we're certainly, I think, the U.S. federal government is a very large enterprise with quite a bit of, I think, market power. I hope the efforts that we're taking, over the last several years on really pushing phishing-resistant authentication is having a broader impact, not just within the government, but across the broader ecosystem.
Karen, any perspectives?
No, I defer to Andy. I think he covered it well.
We were hoping to have, that would have been a great question for Nick Polk from the Office of Management and Budget, who was hoping to get out here and could not get travel approved, unfortunately. So we can take that one back to him next time we see him in DC. Any other questions from the audience? Sabari.
Yes, I had a question. Again, in government, we're really concerned about syncable passkeys and shared passkeys, et cetera. So is that something that the FIDO Alliance could address more as a centralized and a standardized way to do it, so there's more assurance as part of the process? Otherwise, each vendor is already doing what they do. And is there some way to standardize it or make it more like higher assurance, let's say, for the average user?
So I'll take that one in part. So speaking of one of the hats I wear as an advisor to FIDO Alliance, yes, there's ongoing work there. Although we did ask NIST for guidance on how to secure sync fabrics, which, some of that appeared in the supplement and the draft of 63-4. And I think that's actually been helpful in terms of some folks read it and said, oh, there's things they're suggesting we should do that we haven't figured out how to do yet. We should, do some work on that. So I would say there is ongoing work in the Alliance. In fact, with the plenary that's going on this week, there's already been some discussions on proposals in terms of what are those next layers of controls and protections or technologies that we need to make sure are there alongside just keys that sync automatically. And so I would say stay tuned on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different a variety of different architectures that are out there. I think FIDO Alliance is in an interesting position that they can influence things in a variety of ways. Like there's potential for things like guidance, but also I think the FIDO Alliance plays an important role in just providing kind of a venue to have to talk about some of the different approaches that the technology providers are are implementing within their sync fabrics. So. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that the Alliance can do kind of in that general, in that general area.
Any additional questions? All right,
It's tough to be the last panel
it's
of the
tough
day.
to be the last panel of the day, even if you have a heart emoji in the title. So, all right, well, with that, I'm going to say we're going to adjourn 10 minutes early, give you a little bit of time back. Thank you. I would say thanks to Grant, but he's gone already, so I'll shoot him a note. But Andy and Karen, thank you so much for taking the time to travel out here and engage with all of us today. It's been a great discussion, and look forward to seeing you all at the passwordless party in about an hour. Thank you.